Thank you, Ted, and thank you, the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation. Usually I say the Greenwich Village, but it's worth the effort to say the whole title. Please, there is lemonade. If you find yourself thirsty in the middle of this talk, feel free to go and have a refill or get a cup. It's from Grey Dog, so you may know that therefore it's fantastically delicious. And I asked for enough for 50 people, and of course they sent enough for 150 people. So do drink up. It's especially fitting that I'm talking under the auspices of the Greenwich Village Society, because, as Ted mentioned, the purpose of the organization is to celebrate and preserve the architectural heritage and cultural history of the village. My passion as a scholar and a citizen of New York is questions to do with sanitation, street cleaning, garbage, who picks up after us. And what I want to talk about tonight is a particular part of that legacy as it relates to the waters of New York. It's far too big a subject to cover completely in one evening. It actually deserves its own, probably very long book, maybe one of mine in the future. But what I'm going to do this evening is walk us through the relationship of the city to the flow of trash via a few different mechanisms that end up on the flow of our rivers, which, as you probably are aware, the Hudson and the East Rivers are not rivers, they're tidal estuaries, but that's an aside. Those of you who've heard me speak before, some of the material I'm showing you tonight you've already seen, but much of it is new, and one of the pleasures of putting together a presentation for TED, Greenwich, is that he throws very interesting questions at me, and then I have the privilege of digging into them to find some answers that I hope will engage you this evening. So let me fiddle with the lights for just a minute so my board is brighter. Not that way. There we go. Okay. Is this everybody comfortable with this lighting? Are we good with the camera? Everything's good? Okay. A while ago, New York City lost one of its primary methods of garbage disposal. It was an option that had been used for many years, despite vehement protest from nearby communities, and it was stopped only because of court orders and state legislation. In response, the city had to scramble to come up with a new waste disposal infrastructure. The answer was a hodgepodge of expensive, unsustainable alternatives. The problem of municipal solid waste was not solved, it was simply moved. Those of you who know the history of garbage in New York might think I'm talking about the closure of the FRESHKILLS landfill in 2001. But in fact, I'm referring to the Supreme Court decision of 1934 that forbade New York from dumping our garbage at sea. This was a policy that we had been engaged in, a practice that we had been doing for centuries, actually. It's something that, and I almost always start my talks with this quintet of images because they are very simple and very, I believe, quite compelling. This is the original shoreline of Manhattan, and the web on top of it is the contemporary street grid. That pin is Bridge and Broad Street. This is Pearl and Wall Street. Each of these pins is the location where, in 1657, Peter Stuyvesant told New Amsterdammers they were allowed to throw out their trash. So you can see that this was along the shore, but of course, as that web on top suggests, this was the land building project of the Dutch and of every European and then American power after the Dutch. These are the same location. So Pearl and Fuente Slip, this is today, Pearl and Fuente Slip. We have built land and then walked on our own history for centuries, as have most great cities of the world. New York is hardly unique in this. We did, however, create real problems for ourselves back in the 19th century when we were dumping a whole lot of our garbage into the harbor to the point where we actually filled up shipping channels several times in the late 1880s where commercial vessels couldn't come in or go out of New York Harbor. We also, of course, did this in such a way that it was an unpleasant mess for people, Coney Island, if you see here in the middle, and then the dead horse hose sticking up there. We didn't do this particularly well, And we did it in ways that were kind of lazy. I'll get into that in a minute. But one of the consequences of the ways in which we used the water to get rid of garbage was that we built land all over the metropolitan region, to the point where 20% of the larger city is built on fill, and a fully 33% of New York below 14th Street is built on fill, which is a remarkable percentage. It doesn't only refer to the shore. Keep in mind that there are many waterways that we have buried over now, like the Collect Pond, the freshwater pond in Lower Manhattan. So once we were no longer allowed to dump at sea, we had to come up with a couple of, well, we had to come up with an alternative, and we came up with two things, and they're related to the water. The first was what I call by fire. We had already been experimenting with what were called destructors or crematories, what came to be called incinerators, or in contemporary parlance, waste-to-energy facilities. This one in 1905 was one of the first attempts to do waste-to-energy. The power plant created energy that was then used to illuminate the Williamsburg Bridge. The lights of the bridge were powered by burned garbage. The muscle behind this, the way in which the feedstock, as it's called, was put into the combustor to be burned, was this poor fellow. One of the legacies of garbage infrastructure in New York and all over the world is the people who are responsible for keeping it moving. And those are the people who are generally not seen or heard from, except by their peers, and then by their anthropologists. And now by you. This is in 56th Street and 12th Avenue in 1923. They started to build a destructor. Very solid looking building. This is looking out over from 56th Street out over into the North River. The interior was a lot more sophisticated than the Williamsburg plant of 20 years earlier. This technology continually evolves and changes as efficiencies are built into the system. Same location, but 1936. And then again, the same location in the 1950s. Some of you may even remember this building. It was there until the 1990s, although not used as an incinerator that late. You can see in the back, those smokestacks are the part of the original footprint of the building. That's the contemporary facility. It's now a combined garage, also still at 56th and now the West Side Highway. Combined garage. It has Manhattan 7, Manhattan 5, I believe, and 2 broom garages are housed there, and there's a salt shed on the south side that is not visible in that picture. We're going to go back. I'm going to bounce around a little bit tonight from the past to the present, and then we're going to talk about the future. This is up at 215th Street. Any of you who ride the Broadway IRT uptown, the #1 train, you see these smokestacks. This is when it was rebuilt in 1937. This is a contemporary building. This is the one that's still there. And on the inside, the photographer for the Department of Sanitation did a tour inside. And I find these images hauntingly beautiful in a very stark and austere way. This is it today. Very bold, this architecture. Very almost aggressive, but and assertive. You know, these smokestacks there's nothing hesitant about them. In 1928, the facility at East 73rd Street, which is no longer there, but it was only taken down a few years ago. I worked out of this when I was doing my research for the book. This is the interior. So you have, it's at least mechanized. They're driving trucks, not with carts and horses anymore. But so you have the guys up on top with the vehicles, and then you have this poor fellow, these guys in the lower corner. Again, without them, this doesn't flow. It doesn't get into the burners. It doesn't become a little less hazardous than its original form. This is the same facility. Again, these are all the water. We're going to get to the water part in more detail in a minute, but I've seen this particular illustration mislabeled, but the entire thing is the destructor plant. The smaller smokestacks are the destructor plant. The larger smokestacks are the power plant. So it's not all the evil of the street cleaning department. This is Hamilton Avenue in Brooklyn. There's a brand new MTS going up there right now. It's due to come online next year, and it'll be a complete overhaul of the system of tipping garbage into barges. It'll be, it's a It's all containerized. There will not be big fluffy garbage anywhere in sight. And I will tell you, this is breaking news. This just happened as of last Friday. Any of you who take part in the Open House New York weekend in October, Sanitation has decided to step forward and offer tours of the new Hamilton Avenue Marine Transfer Station. You'll be the first people, besides those who are building it, to actually be able to walk around it. So when the OHNY schedule comes out, look for that and sign up. I'm sure it'll be sold out fast. Only on the Saturday of that weekend. There'll be 3 or 4 tours, but that's it. And be nice, because if it doesn't go well, they won't do it again. So I need everybody to think it should go very well. This is the interior of Hamilton Avenue. I have yet to find the records of these men, where they lived, where they grew up, where their obituaries, their families, the level of detail that is left behind by people occupying some of the humblest jobs of the past. Those details are sparse, to say the least, and in many cases simply impossible to find. If anyone has suggestions for me, I would be grateful, because I want to tell their stories, as well as the stories of contemporary workers. Greenpoint, there is still an old MTS there. The incinerator has been down for a while, but it's next to the Department of Environmental Protection water treatment plant called the Eggs. Some of you are familiar with that architecture. Same general vicinity of the city. I'm not going to go through this, don't get nervous by all of this text. But if you ever wanted to know details about the incinerator infrastructure of the city and what kinds of particulates were thrown into the air and what years they were in operation, let me know. I'm happy to send you the reference that this piece comes from. So now we're going to go to the water. Once you burn everything, you have to put it somewhere. It's much smaller, of course, and it takes up less space than if it were still the big fluffy garbage, but it's very heavy, and you have to figure out where to put it. This illustration shows the basic mechanism, although they're not only talking about garbage, but you sweep it, you put it in a cart, you tip it into a barge or a scow. In this case, I believe in the 4th pair of panels, they're dredging, and then you pull it out to sea. The tipping into the barge part, very rudimentary. Same thing we do today with trucks, except no hydraulics back then. This illustration, it's a little hard to discern, but there are people combing through the rubbish as it falls into the barge. This was a very interesting innovation where the carts are taken up to an upper level by escalator or elevator and then tipped up there. I imagine it didn't take as a sort of it wasn't widely used across the city because I'm almost certain this slowed everything down. If you pull up and you dump your cart and you go back out for another load, there's a certain rhythm to that you can account for how much garbage you'll be able to pick up in a given shift. This would have been, it's obviously very fancy. I'm certain it was caused some tardiness in the flow of garbage. This, I'm imagining, got a picture because it's the Department of Street Cleaning barge #1, except that this puzzles me, this picture, because it's not, I guess it's a little lower than the surface of the pier. And then the one to the left, of course, is full and ready to go. Again, this is just showing some of the mechanisms of how rudimentary this work was. Sometimes, of course, the barges didn't exactly go where they're supposed to go. My favorite example of this is a barge that was moored on the east side in the, I forget at what street, somewhere in lower Manhattan, and it was bottomless. Intentionally so. So you could dump and dump and dump, and you never ran out of room. This is a typical scow waiting to go out. They weren't netted, by the way, so any good wind that would come up, a lot of this wouldn't get where it was supposed to go. Again, these are people working the scows. The men here were called scow trimmers. They were largely Italian, and they found things to sell. They would have specialties: buttons, metal, bone, clothing. They also scavenged food, and in many cases, their families would survive because they would actually be helping out with the work, living under the dumps. These images are by Jacob Rees. I just found them a few weeks ago. all of these are taken under the dumping piers, all around the city. So it's not that the dumping piers were empty real estate, although eventually they were all picked out. They're kind of squatting, but they would work and live, and entire families did this. It wasn't just adults. There were children as well. This one, some of you have seen this. It's one of my favorites. This is the real thing. Thomas Edison did a series of these films. If you want to see absolutely beautiful short vignettes of New York City life, Google or look on YouTube for Thomas Edison. 1903, he did all of these different little films, and remember there are people under there, right? As you watch this, and also of course there's no OSHA, there's no worker protection, there's no union, there's no. This is just life.
So they must have had a short life.
Well, the question was they must have had a short life. There were various boards of health and medical authorities who wanted assurances that the people doing this work would not have shorter lives, and testimony of various experts, including in the 1890s, George Waring, who was commissioner of street cleaning, they were certain that Italians were inherently well suited to this work, and that there was something in their racial makeup that meant that they, in fact, not only did they not live shorter lives, they were healthier than the average citizen in doing this work. So most of the barges up to the latter part of the 19th century were very simple boats, and you went out with the load of garbage, and in the very first image I showed you, there were men on top of this mound of trash with rakes and pitchforks and shovels, and it looked precarious, and in fact it was. In the 1880s, early 1890s, there was a newfangled kind of scow that was invented that was, and this illustration is from Scientific American. That's how novel this development was. It was compartmentalized, so that instead of having to offload with pitchforks, there were chains that controlled the bottom of each of these compartments. And you opened the bottom and the garbage fell out. So it was far safer, and it meant that instead of having anywhere from 12 to 20 men on a boat going out to offload, you only needed 2. You had the captain and the mate. And I tell a story in my book about 4 of these scows and 2 tugboats that went out to sea in January of 1892, right ahead of what was essentially a hurricane. And 1 boat came back. And what happened to the other 5? It's in the book. This is the kind of tugboat that pulled the barges out. The tugs used by street cleaning were not always owned by street cleaning, and were often, there were many charges that they were not strong enough for the jobs, that they were too old, that they were leaky boats, leaky tugs, and that they should have been retired years before. Street cleaning was not always using the top of the line stuff. So they're out at sea, they're offloading. Oh yeah, I'm going to come back to this. Okay, so there, I wanted to just point out in this illustration, you see the house. Sorry, camera, I'm off. You see this house in the back? That's where, when there was inclement weather, that's where the men would be able to be a little bit out of the worst of it. But those structures sometimes blew off in really bad storms. Occasionally you would read stories about how the workers who were supposed to go out with the scows simply refused to do it because the weather was too treacherous. And they were usually depicted as shirkers and lazy, no good, you know, that they were trying to take advantage of the system. Having read many accounts of what they faced when they were out there, they were probably simply being very cautious and sensible. Anyway, that's also in that chapter. So you remember this illustration of the destructor plant at 56 and 12th Avenue. This is the same building right in the back, right? In 1951. And I show this just to show you a little bit of the maritime, those very rich maritime life that was still part of the city at that moment. still there. It's the Con Ed plant on 50, is that 59?
The huge one.
The huge one, yes. And those smokestacks were intentionally meant to imitate the funnels of the great ocean liners when that building was built. And it was built as the power station for the IRT. It still generates electricity, but now, of course, not so much for the IRT as for the rest of the city.
And it's not landmarked.
Yes, that's correct. It's not landmarked. It has a sister up in Yonkers that is also not landmarked, that I understand is undergoing renovations now to be preserved as something wonderful. There's a whole chain of these across the region, some of which have been torn down, some of which have been butchered into weird amalgams of contemporary architecture inside the shell of the old architecture. They were kind of the cathedrals of their day, in that they were celebrating the innovations in which science was going to make better lives for all of us. And it's not landmarked, and it should certainly be. Yeah, that's right. It is a Stanford Way. I think the one in Yonkers is also. That I heard there's some folks who've been writing and talking about that a little bit. I'm no expert, but let's get that landmark. That's a good one. All right, so this is Pier 99. This is the dumping pier, sanitation. It says disposal station. One of the pleasures of doing research in this area is watching how the language morphs, right? We now call this a marine transfer station. How would you know what that is? A disposal station is a little bit more evocative. It was before that called a dumping board. Very blunt. This is the same pier after in 74. This is the same one today. This was built by Dattner, designed by Dattner Associates Architects. It's now used as a paper dump. All paper in Manhattan that gets recycled is tipped here and then pulled to the cracked recycling plant in Staten Island. But you see it's the same mechanism. It's not a cart or horse, but it's a truck, and you're tipping it into a barge, a scow, that is then being pulled by a tugboat. This is the blue building in the middle. That's the combined garage at 56th and 12th Avenue. That's tall. Smokestack is the last one, still standing on the power plant. And then beyond that, the blue on the left, that's the transfer station. That's this. And I like that sort of panorama of all of those pieces of the infrastructure. We're going to move uptown briefly. This is at 135th Street and the North River. You all know the North River. It's the Hudson River, right? But it was called the North River. Well, I won't get into that. But yeah, so this is the transfer station, marine transportation built in the 50s. This is what it looks like today. It's been scavenged by boat from the inside out. So people come at night by boat and they take off the siding and sell it because it's metal. This is the same facility from the park of the North River Water Treatment Plant, which is immediately to the north of it. You just see a wall of it to the right in this picture. But those two essential pieces of infrastructure, of course, are cheap to gel, which is, they often happen, and I like that they still are. We've been very creative in how we've tipped our trash into various water vessels. This is the Williamsburg Bridge. We use the Brooklyn Bridge. Even until 1960, we were using it as a sort of an open-air dumping area. Now, some of you will have seen these images before, so bear with me. The FRESHKILLS landfill was opened in 1948, and Robert Moses vowed it would be open for 3 years only. He wanted to fill in the swamps to make an anchorage for a bridge to New Jersey. Staten Islanders successfully fought it for more than 10 years, but they finally lost to him. And this is kind of how it worked. The barges would come, the cable cranes would offload, they would put the garbage directly into these wagons. At-bay wagons, they were called. They were used through the 1980s, which tells you that, in fact, it was not closed in 1951. They went up the hill to the active bank where they tipped. They're three-sided, which you can see, I think, in this image. And bear with me, I do like this little. What I say about this image, I always say this about this image. If you work in a place without a window, or you have loud people working next to you, or you just hate where you work because it's just miserable, remember this poor fellow in his office. This is the supervisor's office that it was pulled around by that tractor to the open face to supervise the workers who were mounding the garbage, because the garbage, even in the early days, was not mounded casually and haphazardly. It was engineered, very carefully engineered, and more carefully over time. This is a picture I took last month, actually. They've taken one of these left, and they've begun to restore it, which I think is sort of lovely. It's the same thing as what we saw in the earlier images. The barges are a different color now, and it says DS as in DSNY instead of DSC, but it's the same thing. It's being pulled to, by the early 90s, the last landfill in New York City, which was here. This image is from 1995, published by Rand McNally, and you can see up here above where it says Staten, it says FRESHKILLS Park undeveloped. At this moment in the city's history, there were no park nowhere near FRESHKILLS. It was a thriving landfill. It had just stopped taking in something like 26,000 tons of garbage a day, and that number fell when privates were priced out of the, when the tipping fee was raised and privates went elsewhere. But this was not a park. Why Rand McNally in 1995 couldn't put landfill? Again, the language around the whole project of garbage is always revealing. This locates it for you a little bit in the context of the larger city. The barges would come in, and there were several different landing areas where they would be offloaded and then staged and then returned. You never wanted a bottleneck. You always wanted a portion of the barges in transit, a portion of the barges being offloaded, and a portion of the barges going back to their starting point. That's where the flow of garbage had to be maintained and had to be smooth. And of course, you're dealing with myriad variables you can't control, like weather and mechanical problem and the conditions of the water on any given day. Over time, the cable cranes became hydraulic cranes, safer and more efficient, but the same basic project of offloading. The difference became, instead of putting them directly into a wagon or a dump truck, the garbage was put on a sort of a loading pad, and then the blue front-end loader would put it inside this dump truck. And it's hard to show you scale on this image, but the cab of the truck is here, and just look at the wheel of the front-end loader. That's my class at FRESHKILLS in 1995 in front of the wheel of that front-end loader. The pay hauler would take it up to the active bank, and it was tipped. For political reasons mostly, although certainly Staten Island had already endured far more than its fair share of New York's garbage burden. In 2001, the landfill was closed. It had years of capacity left, both in terms of space and time, but not in terms of Staten Islanders' patience, quite understandably so. And it looked more like this, more or less like this. This was a section that had already been closed pretty shortly after the last barge arrived. And of course, you see on the horizon the Twin Towers. So when this happened, the people who still worked at FRESHKILLS knew immediately, before the city made any official decision, that the material had to come there for a few reasons. It was transportable by barge. It was transportable by barge efficiently. The location that they chose for the material was able to be secured. It was flat, it was big, it was empty. So they could do the kind of very detailed recovery and excavation work that they needed to do without any kind of outside interference or threats. This has taken about 3 weeks into that operation. It became much more elaborate than this. It basically became sort of a mini city unto itself. Part of the story of September 11th that has yet to be told is sanitation's involvement in that entire effort. Because the landfill is always a dynamic geography. You can't just show up with a load of material from, say, the Trade Center and pitch a tent and start to sort it out. That pit, the stake for the tent, if you hit a methane retrieval line, you blow up the hill. So one of the challenges sanitation faced was teaching all the other government representatives who were on that hill how to be gentle, basically, with the geography that looked kind of like the moon. I mean, it was just an empty landscape at the time, but never a passive one. And that's one of the reasons that turning it into a park is going to take another couple of 3 decades. However, it now has begun to look kind of like this. And if you are in New York on the last Sunday of September this year, I urge you to go to FRESHKILLS Sneak Peek, which is when the Parks Department throws open every part of FRESHKILLS that they can. And you are welcome to fly kites, go kayaking, go running, go hiking, ride horses. You can come talk to me for our hit and run oral history project that we do out there every year. I took my students out there again this spring. This is what it looks like. It's actually fantastically beautiful. It's one of my very favorite places in New York City, and I'm deeply passionate about many places in New York City, but FRESHKILLS is near the top of the list. One of my students did an in-depth oral history interview with a fellow named Frank Zito, who was a Marine dispatcher for sanitation for much of his career. And she created a map based on his narrative of what it was like to manage the marine operation of sanitation while we were still dumping into barges and pulling it out to FRESHKILLS. So if you want to learn more, each of the pins on that map has an image and an audio clip from Christine's interview with Frank. I realize throwing a URL at you isn't very helpful, but if you want to learn more, I'm happy to give you more detail. Okay, last part, we're going to bring this home. Gansevoort. You all know what Gansevoort is? Okay, Gansevoort is several things. It's a street in the West Village. It's also, the Gansevoort Peninsula is the only piece of real estate on the Hudson River right now that is actually land, north of Chambers Street and south of, gosh, probably the GW Bridge. This is a map from 1865. This is the Veely map. I really need a pointer. I'm so sorry. I'm great. Where it juts out, that's the beginning of what became what is now called the Gansevoort Peninsula. Bear with me. This gets a little bit easier because I'm going to do some detailed maps of this, or sort of close-ups of this. See the green sort of trapezoidal shape here? This area? That is the Gansevoort Peninsula. Except that, and if any of you can answer this for me, I will be grateful because this confuses me with these maps. So here's Gansevoort. And there's Bloomfield Street. Okay? This is called 13th Avenue. Same thing here. This is, see 13th Avenue, right? And there, that box, that's the, wait, that's not this. That's the, where it says Market Stage, that's also Gansevoort. This is 3 different stretches of the Hudson River with the piers jutting into the water, one imposed on top of the other, right? This is the one I'm interested in here. This is at 12th Street. This is 1895. Because it's a garbage dump. And it says, finally, not all of the maps, the Sanborn maps are some of the best, as some of you may know. And in 1904, the key I'm not going to go into, but if you ever have a spare moment at your office or you're at a computer and you go into the New York Public Library digital collection, they have this new feature called Zoom Enhanced with the scroll wheel, flywheel, something. You can read in extremely high resolution, the smallest type on these things. If I were in the library, I'd need a magnifying glass, which of course I've done many times and is its own pleasure, but on the screen you can get this, you can almost see the fingerprints of the people who made the map. It's really quite remarkable. But so this is a detail of that same map, and where you have that quartet up here sticking into the water, that's Gansevoort, all right? Same year, same series of maps. This is a little bit clearer, I think. All those piers. All those piers. This is the same thing from a slightly different angle. This is that market, that square, the picture where I showed you that had the market square. Where was it? There. the market stage, that empty space, that's this in 1900. Now, we have to jump forward to 1940 because I didn't find anything that gave us pictures of this particular location between 1900 and 1940. But in 1940, Robert Moses, our friendly local czar, dictator, urban planner, commissioner of everything, decided that we needed another incinerator there because, remember 1934, we couldn't dump it at sea anymore, right? So we had to burn it. And so he put it there. This is a pier. This is at 12th Street. Behind this, at that moment, this was going on to make this, which, when it was finished, looked like this. There's the marine transfer station, also called disposal station, also called dumping board, the incinerator in the back. You can burn the garbage, and what you can't burn, you can take the ashes and what you can't burn, and you drive it into the transfer station. You tip it into a barge, and then you drive out the other way. So it's and that's the West Side Highway. Yes, on the near the top of the image. This is a contemporary picture. Now, this is something I learned from you all when I gave this talk, I think last year. Remember I showed you on those maps 13th Avenue? Mm-hmm. This is 13th Avenue. What happened to the rest of 13th Avenue? I don't know. And it's a puzzle for the piers. Yes, but there was a lot of land there, which is, when I've looked at these Sanborn maps, I can't quite figure it out. Yes, they did take it down for piers, but then they also, I want to know the progression. When did they decide to do that? And when did how, because this is what they left. I'll get to that. This is the marine transfer station today. This is from the inside, which I think is rather beautiful. This odd corrugated plastic. It's sort of cathedral-like. Yes? Yes. This is from the roof of the incinerator, the old incinerator, looking out at the river. This is that whole facility from the water. You'll see there are no more smokestacks. Those were taken down at the neighborhood's request in 1984. This is used as garages now, the transfer station. They sealed the bottom and they brought in trailers, but it is colder than a well digger's ass in the winter, even with the trailers, just if you're over there, dress warmly. This is the same thing from the north side, from the water. These are just pictures of the building as it is now. This pass-through, you see the windows in the front on the highway side. If you walk through, that's what that looks like. And really, when you think about extending the Hudson River Park north, right, because this land is eventually ceded to the Hudson River Park. In fact, I think they actually own it now. This could be, the park could flow right through this. You could have this like the High Line has buildings built over it when it's raining or it's really hot and you need shade, you can go in there. Imagine this as a river of grass, right, with picnic tables and concessions. And I hope that if this building were to be preserved, they could keep the lettering from when it was the Gansevoort Chapter plans. Maybe we need to fix the R, but it's such a lovely font. So here we are back at the maps. This is where I get confused about 13th Avenue, because this is Gansevoort, and that's Bloomfield at the top of that quintet, and then you see 13th Avenue. But it's not there anymore. And in fact, this is what it looks like today. So 13th Avenue is this street. And what happened to the rest of it? This is the art picture, artsy picture that I did. When I was talking about the park flowing through the building, right, it would be right behind those big windows. It could be a really dynamic part of the life of the park. In fact, since the purpose of my work with sanitation is in part to help us understand the legacy of the job and the legacy of the labor and the legacy of savvy solid waste management, including the costs of not doing it well, right? I think the department deserves a museum. Transit has one, police have one, fire has one, skyscrapers have one, sex has one, Italians have one.
Mathematics.
I don't know about the Irish. But there are so many wonderful museums in the city serving really noble causes. This is no less worthy and no less noble. many other wonderful things. I'm not saying I want the whole thing. Just that little, just that. And that's my talk for this evening. Did I do lights?
Yeah.
Sure.
There was 1 second left.
That's better.
No, well, that's
So
better.
night.
We'll see us.
Yeah, I need to see you. There we are.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Perfect.
that's good. All right.
Lots of questions.
Lots of questions. Sir in the back, in the middle.
Hi. If you want a museum, it's a great idea. I'm wondering, does the Department of Sanitation have an archive? Or do they have materials to put on display?
I am so glad you asked that question. Yes. If we're going to have a museum, does the Department of Sanitation have an archive and have materials to put on display? There are some materials, and there are archives scattered haphazardly and illogically across the city. So one of my projects, working with the Public History and Archives Management Program here at NYU, is to begin to fix that problem. And we've identified 5 key starting points. There's a brand new commissioner of sanitation, Catherine Garcia, who came from the Department of Environmental Protection, where about 15 years ago, Kevin Bone and some other scholars put together a series of exhibitions about the history of water in New York. And in that effort, discovered that the DEP archives were basically a bunch of moldy boxes in very unfortunate places. So they started organizing, and they now have an extraordinarily carefully, thoughtfully put together set of documents, and they have a long way to go, but they've made major progress. And I'm working with the DEP archivists to sort of begin to get a sense of what is a good starting point. And in fact, they have told me, yes, there are lots of logistical and legal requirements of archives, and there's also the start, just start. Grab a box and go, right? Catalog it, scan it, upload it, put it somewhere safe. We had a conversation with the municipal archivists downtown last fall, and I said, look, if we do the labor, will you house the documents? And they were very happy with that because, of course, they're understaffed and overwhelmed. And if we give them everything, they'll just be in boxes and no one will ever be able to find them. But if we do the work and then give them everything, they care for it, and we've made it accessible. So that's a project in progress. I hope to have more to tell you about that in a few months. Thank you for that question. Let me go on and yes, ma'am.
I have 2 questions. One is, was there a particular architect who did a lot of these sanitation buildings in the same way that the Board of Education had Snyder? And my second question is a little more complicated. The conspiracy-minded, I suppose you might call them, just concerned people wanted more information about September 11th, what it meant, its aftermath, said that the material that was removed to FRESHKILLS was not treated as proper crime scene material should have been treated. And I just wondered what your comment was on that.
Okay, thank you. I don't know who the architect was for the sanitation facilities, and I'm very pleased with that question because now I want to find out. I'll get back to you. I can tell you who the architect was for the new building at 56th Street that has that lovely undulating blue wall. His name is Michael Friedlander, and he works for the Department of Sanitation. He's an in-house architect. Award-winning, actually. But this kind of thing, which is its own architectural legacy. Someone said to me once, look, as a museum, that's architecturally quite bland. Okay, well, we can debate that. But it is of a moment, and it is of a style, and it is of a time in the city's history when, yeah, that's how we built these kinds of structures. And in fact, we built schools that looked like this too then. And there are some apartment buildings around the city that look kind of like this. So this was its moment. For September 11th, the searching and sorting was organized by a team of professionals in criminal justice and criminal investigation and federal, state, and local law enforcement experts, many of whom had lost colleagues and friends and loved ones. They had as deep a stake in doing that job right as anybody in the city. And they have heard these charges that it was done sloppily, or it was done too fast, or the volume of material was such that they couldn't go through it as carefully as they should have, or they should have gone to a smaller set of fines. And I will tell you from listening to them respond to these charges, they get very emotional about it because they took great pride in doing this work with as much care as they possibly could. I was not on site during that work, and I observed none of it up close, but I have talked to both casually and done formal interviews with many, many people who work. And I don't know, I guess I would say to people who feel that the work was done sloppily, show me how, show me what you mean, show me how someone cut a corner, or show me how someone decided, oh, it's not really worth giving it that extra effort. Some of the people who worked up there still have a hard time talking about it. Like a soldier in a war context, there's I think it's a form of PTSD that when they do talk about it, some of them, it marked them for life, the way it marked so many of us for life. And they gave it their all. So I think that those charges are not true. Yes, sir.
I had two questions. I think you answered the first one. It was about the new facilities. For example, the garage at Spring Street
Yes.
is a wonderful building.
I'm glad you think so.
And then the salt shed that's proposed, it looks like Gary did it. So would that be Mr. Friedlander and an internal team that's doing these great new structures? And then I have another unrelated question.
That structure, I believe, is not the internal guy. And
Which
in
one,
fact,
the salt shed or the new garage?
Either one. And I just was talking to somebody this week about the architect for the new someone used the fire exit. That's all right. And I can't remember his name, but it's not Freelander for either one.
The other question is, how does recycling happen, especially with my inconsiderate neighbors who mix the food with the metal? And I mean, does it really happen? You can tell us. We won't tell anyone.
The answer is yes, it really happens. And in fact, the infrastructure that's in place to make sure it happens has never been more elaborate and never been more, well, the effort to integrate it into our daily lives has never been more ardently pursued. How well it's integrated depends on each of us, and when your neighbors throw their food into the metal, the technical term for that is contamination. When it goes to the curb, the people in the recycling truck, they don't know that it's contaminated, they're going to just pick it up. The volume of material is now such that if it's going to, say, the new Sims Metals plant out in Brooklyn, they're not going to pull out your cat food tin that you didn't wash because you have an unwashed cat, or that there's food in it. There's just, the volume is too big. But if the contamination is too extensive, like let's say an entire truck is, you have maybe a paper recycling truck and then someone comes with their bucket of some sort of slop while you're not looking and throws it in the back of your truck, that truck has to be dumped as garbage. It can't be, it won't go to the paper, it can't be tipped as paper. So contamination is a problem. A solution to that is called single stream. But actually that's a whole other conversation about how garbage is most efficiently segregated into what can be recycled and what can't be recycled, and how those definitions are even changing as we go along, like the composting and organics program that is rolling out right now. I am so hopeful that that will stick, and I am a little skeptical for many reasons. And other cities have made it work, but other cities have lower population density. They have systems where everything is collected by one city. We have a system where municipal household waste is collected by the city. Commercial waste is collected by private carters, as many as 200 different companies. And then something called C&D, construction and demolition debris, that's also collected by privates. And those are 3 different categories of waste. And you could work recycling into all 3 of them, but right now, the way it is in New York, because there are 3 separate bureaucratic systems, integrating recycling across the board has yet to be done. I could talk all night about recycling. I highly recommend a book about recycling and why it looks the way it does and why it maybe could look different and how. The author's name is Samantha McBride. The book is called Recycling Reconsidered. I'm pleased with and proud of my book, but Samantha's book is, I think, an extraordinary accomplishment and probably one of the most important books of contemporary environmental issues that has come out in the last 20 years. Yes, sir.
I was curious if organic material, is all of that today incinerated or is any of it dumped?
We, in Manhattan, send all of our waste to a waste-to-energy facility. And I heard some of you chuckle when I used that phrase. That is the phrase of the contemporary incinerator. And all of ours goes to one of 2, there are 2 different plants in New Jersey. And right now, it means that you have a truck with 10 or 15 tons, and it goes all the way to New Jersey and then all the way back. Other boroughs, their garbage, there are a couple of facilities in Long Island that are where the garbage is incinerated, but the rest of it goes to landfills. And the landfills are reached by transfer stations where we tip the garbage, but then a private company, there are a few different ones with whom we have contracts, they take it to the next step, to the landfill step, by rail or by tractor trailer.
So these go some distance from us?
Oh, they go way far away.
Yeah. And another question quickly is at FRESHKILL, there's organic material there and we're getting methane off of it, etc.
Yes, the organics in FRESHKILLS will be subsiding over the next few decades. It's one of the reasons turning FRESHKILLS into a park is a long, slow process. The methane retrieval network was the first in the country. It was put in place in 1982 and was back then pulling out, I forget how many millions of, what do you measure gas in? Okay, BTUs. Lots of those. And of course, as the waste subsides and you have less and less material decomposing, the quantity of methane decreases. There's also a leachate retrieval system that's knit into the structure of FRESHKILLS so that as leachate is garbage juice. It's the liquid that then is sort of leached out. It's not just rain, although some of it is rain. Household waste is an average of 35% moisture by volume, so or by weight. One or both of those. And that has to go somewhere, and it's pretty toxic. So the leachate retrieval system pulls it out, and there's a plant adjacent to FRESHKILLS where it's treated and released into the waterway, same as the water treatment facilities run by the DEP deal with sewage.
And there's apparently, I know how you feel about the sanitation people, all which I think is wonderful. But I gather today, at least this aspect of it is incredibly automated.
Which aspect of it?
Well, like you showed, the dumping and the collecting, and you don't need many people.
Well, actually, back in the day, we threw it in the back of a cart, and then we took the cart to the dumping board, right?
Yeah.
Today, it is not automated in New York. We throw it in the back of a truck, and then we drive the truck to someplace to dump it. So there are fewer people on the job. I think at its height, sanitation employed something like 15,000 people. And today the entire workforce is about 9,000, of whom 7,000 are uniformed workers and about 2,000 are civilian employees. And when I say uniform workers, I mean across all ranks. So it's about 6,000 sanitation workers, the guys behind and women behind the trucks. And then the next 1,000 or so are the supervisory levels on up, from the foremen, supervisors, to the 4-star chiefs. But in New York, it's not automatable the way it would be in a suburban context, because imagine pulling up on, I don't know, pick a street, James Street, on garbage day, and having an automated arm come down and reach for the garbage can, except, well, there's the car in the way. Well, oh well. We don't have, when the grid plan was put in place, right, there were no alleys. We have garbage. It's something that we as New Yorkers kind of don't see, and that newcomers to the city are astonished by, which is our piles of trash, either on garbage day or when commercial businesses put it out at the end of every day for the privates to come get it. We don't see that so much anymore, but visitors sure do. And in fact, one of my students did a beautiful project around the garbage stains on the sidewalks that I had never noticed. And I'm pretty observant, and sanitation is my thing, but she pointed out these garbage stains. They're kind of ripe in the summer, actually, but it's not automated in New York, which is one of my points. We rely on human beings to do this job every day into a well, and one of the reasons that we take them for granted is because they do the job more or less pretty well every day. Unlike, there's another talk I give that some of you have heard about the history of the problem of solid waste in New York and how until 1895, it was literally knee-deep, the garbage in the streets. And people were dying of diseases that even then we knew how to prevent, because the living conditions here were abysmal. In any neighborhood not rich enough to hire essentially an early version of a business improvement district, right? Which would be most of us. And once that problem was solved, sanitation workers were considered heroes, briefly. But then we got used to it. And now they're just schmucks who drive big loud trucks and they get in the way, you know? If we were without them, the system can be improved. I'm not saying the system is flawless by any means, and I'm not saying there are not some sanitation people who are, maybe they're not such good guys. Just like at NYU, there are some people who are not such good people, just like, you know, it's a very rich culture unto itself. So, but if we didn't have a system that worked well, this city would not be the glittering capital that we imagine it to be. And that, in fact, in many ways it is. That's a foundational element that we have to do well, and that we more or less do well. Yes, ma'am?
Do you have any information about the garbage strikes that occurred, or photographs? Because I wish I could in photos. I remember people eating at kiosks, and there was a garbage pile all up against the windows. And
yeah, there's a, if you spend any time, there's a lot about the garbage strikes, and that's a whole very rich subject. John Delory, to members of Teamsters Local 831, is sort of a god. Delory was the first president of the Uniform Sanitation Men's Association. The only place I've ever seen sanitation men's, all one word, no apostrophe, sanitation men's. And still, never mind women have been on the job since 1986. Sanitation men's. I would refer you to the original version of the movie The Out-of-Towners.
Oh, yes.
Jack Lemmon and
Sandy.
It was filmed here during the strike, the famous strike, the 68 strike. And it's in the background of many of the scenes. And there's one beautiful moment. Remember when they've left Grand Central Station in the middle of the night in the pouring rain, they've gone the wrong direction, they finally realize they've gone the wrong direction, they're turning around to go back, they're drenched. You know, it's the middle of this series of mishaps. And they encounter, or Sandy Dennis encounters, this mountain of trash. She has this moment, this mountain of trash. She just says, who's going to take it all away? I'm watching the movie going, yes, that's the question. That's the question. So that's a good movie to get a sense of the city. Also, Central Park looks like it was bombed. I mean, just 1968 New York City was a very different place.
Robin, I'm going to interrupt 1 second. Just take 1 or 2 more questions, please. I want to make sure that you have time to sit at the table and sell and sign your books.
Okay.
Thank you.
Ed.
Just a point of reference, I got a sneak preview of Sims.
Oh, yes.
So when the tours are open, do go.
Yeah.
It is incredible.
Yeah.
The high tech that they put in this place.
I took my students there in April in a pre-tour as well, and thank you for giving them that plug. It really is.
It's absolutely incredible.
Yeah, it is a marvel to behold. And if Tom Outerbridge gives you the spiel,
He did.
Tom is, some of you may know Tom, he worked for sanitation and recycling for a while, and he's been with Sims since before it was called Sims, and he's great. He's great. He knows every question you have, he knows the answer, and he loves this stuff. And he really conveys that.
Does organized crime have any stake in the private collection of garbage?
It used to the point that Mayor Giuliani put together a sting operation across years in the early 1990s. And the result of that is a book called Takedown by an author named Rick Cowan, and I forget, he worked with a ghostwriter. But he was an undercover cop who spent 6 years breaking the hold of organized crime on the private carting business. The current state of affairs, I don't know any details if there are mob involvements in any of the private companies. There are today many really big, like Waste Management is a key player in New York City on the private side. And I don't want to say they are mobbed up in any way, but they're big enough that they have sort of legal rights to act in a thuggish way sometimes, according to some small businesses that have to. But it's not in any way the same depth of corruption that it used to be. Last one, then last one.
2 questions. Why haven't plastic bags been banned? And 2, what percentage of the sanitation men actually make it to retirement without disability? It seems like a back-breaking job.
Plastic bags have not been banned because there are no good alternatives. Metal cans dent and rust and hold a lot of water. Plastic cans do the same.
No, I'm sorry, I meant plastic bags from
That's
grocery
right.
stores.
Oh, from grocery stores.
Sorry.
Oh, why have they not been banned? Well, there's a movement afoot in the city council to ban them, and there's pushback from people. I think the proposal right now is not to ban them, but to charge money for them, like 10 cents a pop. And a lot of people are unhappy about having to pay 10 cents a pop for a garbage shopping bag. It doesn't do much to diminish the quantity of waste, because garbage bags themselves are a very small percentage of the garbage that we get rid of every day. What it could do is change our habits in ways that then would have a ripple effect going forward. And in that way, it could be a wonderful sort of legislative change in the way we go about our daily lives. And therefore, it's controversial. Is this nanny state, again, telling us, no, you have to remember your cotton bag or your whatever, your backpack? So because it touches the rhythm of people's daily lives, it's got controversy stuff all over. And what was your second question? Hazards, yes. Thank you for asking that. Because, and do they retire without disability? Yeah. Sanitation workers have what the Bureau of Labor Statistics calculates is one of the 10 most dangerous jobs in the country because of the kinds of injuries that they sustain all the time and because of the risk of death on the job. The most recent death was 3 weeks ago. A sanitation worker in Queens was killed. He left behind 4 small children and his wife, and I mean, it was horrific. It did not get the media play that the firefighter got, who was killed more recently. And I appreciate the tragedy of the death of the firefighter. I'm not sure why it's more tragic than the sanitation one. But they do. If you talk to anybody with any time on the job, they will give you an inventory of their injuries. And a lot of them don't make it to retirement without some form of disability.
Just because of the weight of, the lifting.
There's the weight, there's the lifting, there's the traffic, there's the stuff in the truck that comes flying back out of the truck. There are little things, like this amazed me when I first started working with sanitation. When you're moving in between cars, license plates are often bent and dinged in such a way that if you're moving too fast and if the gap is too small, it catches your legs. So you get scars, you get tears. The commissioner, I sat down with her to do the first of a series of interviews about a week and a half ago. And I said, what are your priorities? And she said, very first, absolutely, top of the list, safety for the workers. And she's investigating, is there some fabric that the uniforms could be, at least the pant legs could be made of, that would offer a little more protection against that kind of chronic, casual sometimes devastating slice, because then you have risks of tetanus and whatnot. And a lot of the people that I've worked with, men and women, you see blood like pouring down their leg, and they're like, oh, it's okay, it's fine. So yes, it's very hazardous. Far more dangerous than being a cop or a firefighter. And I mean no disrespect to cops and firefighters, but we could share the law. You're the last question.
All right, I'll try and be quick. So there are these three systems for garbage collection in New York City. Sort of on the street level, is there much contact between the sanitation workers of the Department of Sanitation and those of the private companies?
No, because they mostly work at completely different hours. We work during the day, the privates tend to work at night. The privates also feel like sanitation workers have a very cushy deal, and in fact, they do have generally better benefits, better starting salary. I don't know about long-term salary. So there's a little bit of rivalry between the two groups, but they don't generally have a lot of contact with each other.
Thank you, Robin. Sign yourself in.